Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Let's get right to it.
Yeah, so think about a farmer in the early 17th century. He's standing in his harvested field, and he's holding a small slip of paper
Right.
because the colonial government has just confiscated his entire crop to feed its military forces. And in exchange, the official hands him this paper, which is, a promissory note.
A note that everyone knows is worthless.
Exactly. Well, yes.
Yeah.
The farmer knows it. The official knows it. The regional treasury is completely depleted. That note is never going to be honored.
No, it's not.
And this wasn't just some one-off event or an anomaly. This systematic, legalized expropriation was a foundational economic policy.
It was built into the system.
Right. So today, we are unpacking the 333-year Spanish colonial history of the Philippines.
And it is a vast topic.
It really is. We're going to look at the structural changes, the systemic economic extraction, the centuries of continuous resistance, and the eventual rise of a national consciousness.
Which is such a crucial development.
It is. For anyone listening who is interested in how global trade networks, religion, and colonial administration shape a nation's identity to this very day, understanding this specific period is absolutely essential.
Yeah, you really can't grasp the modern reality without it.
And the historical records actually give us a highly detailed look at this era, starting with the very first European contact. So we have to set the scene in the year 1521.
We do. But to understand the impact of 1521, you really first have to understand the geopolitical baseline of the region.
Right, before the Spanish even show up.
Right. Before they arrived, the archipelago was characterized by localized, highly decentralized maritime communities. These were known as barangays.
And they were pretty independent, right?
Very much so. They were organized along intricate kinship ties and ruled by local chieftains called datus. They relied primarily on shifting cultivation, hunting, and robust maritime trading.
So they were already deeply connected to trade networks.
Oh, definitely. And by the 15th century, Islam had been introduced through Brunei, taking root in Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago.
Establishing those early sultanates.
Yes, establishing very powerful sultanates that extended all the way north to the settlement of Manila. So that is the complex, interconnected world Ferdinand Magellan stumbled into.
Right. So Magellan lands at Limasawa Island in March 1521. He plants a wooden cross on a hill overlooking the sea and just claims the entire region for the King of Spain.
Naming it the Archipelago of St. Lazarus.
Which is just a profound clash of worldviews. I mean, Magellan arrives representing this expanding Spanish empire, driven by a desire to secure a share of the highly lucrative spice trade.
And he immediately begins imposing a completely foreign political and religious framework onto sovereign societies.
But that initial foray ends abruptly.
It does.
Shortly after claiming the islands, Magellan is killed at the Battle of Mactan at the hands of warriors led by the local Dadi Lapu-Lapu.
So the indigenous resistance was immediate.
And in this first instance, successful at halting European expansion.
It stopped the Spanish momentum entirely.
Yeah, because Spain sends subsequent expeditions, right? Loisa in 1525, Cabot in 1526, Saavedra in 1527, Villalobos in 1542.
And they all end in failure.
Largely due to starvation, shipwreck, and hostile encounters. It takes over 40 years for Spain to gain a permanent foothold.
Which really highlights the sheer persistence of the Spanish crown. I mean, especially considering the catastrophic financial ruin of those early expeditions.
They just kept throwing resources at it.
They did. The turning point finally comes with the expedition led by Miguel López de Legazpi. He departs from the modern Mexican state of Jalisco in 1564 and arrives in Cebu in 1565.
And a critical component of his success was his chief navigator, right?
Yes, the Augustinian friar Andrés de Urdaneta. Urdaneta discovered the Tornaviaje.
The return route.
Right, the return route across the Pacific to Mexico.
Yeah.
Because without a reliable return current, a sustainable colony was geographically impossible.
Since the earlier fleets couldn't send word back to the Americas?
Precisely. They were just sailing into the void.
Well, we need to look closely at Legazpi's forces here because the popular conception is usually just a fleet of Spaniards planting a flag.
And that's highly inaccurate.
Right. The sources explicitly document that his expedition included 200 to 400 Tlaxcalan soldiers from Mexico.
Yes, Spain was actively utilizing indigenous forces from its previous conquests in the Americas to pacify the Philippines.
That interconnected nature of the Spanish Empire is so notable.
It really is. These Tlaxcalan soldiers had allied with Spain during the conquest of Mexico, and now they were deployed across the Pacific Ocean.
And a lot of them stayed.
Many of them settled permanently in the islands. This is actually why we see numerous Nahuatl words absorbed into the local Philippine languages.
So, the colonization of the Philippines was an imperial project utilizing resources, tactics, and manpower directly from New Spain.
Right from the start.
But Legazpi doesn't stay in Cebu. He eventually pushes north. By 1570, he sends his commander, Martin de Goiti, to conquer Manila.
Which was a walled Muslim settlement ruled by Raja Suleiman on the Pasig River.
So, why leave Cebu? I mean, it seems like a logistical nightmare to abandon an established settlement and march an entire colonial apparatus hundreds of miles north?
Well, if we evaluate the strategic realities of the era, it was an economic necessity.
How so?
Cebu was suffering from persistent agricultural shortages, and it was highly vulnerable to naval blockades by the Portuguese.
Because the Portuguese were fiercely protecting their own territorial claims in the nearby Spice Islands.
Right, so Luzon, and specifically the Pasig River Delta, offered a far superior harbor.
And immediate access to established, wealthy trade networks with Chinese merchant fleets.
Exactly. I mean, it's sort of similar to a Roman general shifting his legion from an isolated barren hill down into a fertile river valley.
Right, to monopolize the regional grain supply and control the vital trade arteries. You move your capital to where the economic leverage exists.
That is an apt comparison. Manila was a strategic choke point.
So Legazpi follows Goiti a year later in 1571 with a larger fleet.
A fleet comprising Spanish soldiers and a majority Visayan indigenous force.
He defeated the local resistance, renamed the area Nueva Castilla, and declared it the capital of the Spanish East Indies.
And then he built Intramuros.
The walled city.
Right, a fortified walled city, which was baptized as the Distinguished and Ever Loyal City.
And Intramuros became the exclusive domain of the Spanish elite, right?
Yes, the governor, administrators, friars, and military officials, while a polyglot community of Filipinos, Chinese, and other foreigners lived entirely outside its walls.
So they have this fortress city built to project power, but conquering the physical space was only the first step.
Because Spain now had to figure out how to govern this incredibly remote archipelago.
Located thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean, and their solution to this administrative challenge is pretty fascinating.
It is. They administered the Philippines not directly from Madrid, but through the Viceroyalty of New Spain, based in Mexico City.
Which means from 1565 until 1821, when Mexico achieved independence, the Philippines was ruled as a captaincy general subordinated to New Spain.
That's right.
I find this administrative structure a bit perplexing, honestly. I mean, why govern a Southeast Asian territory through a proxy in Mexico?
You'd think direct control would be better.
Right. If you were the king of Spain, why not establish direct communication immediately to ensure your edicts are being followed?
It entirely comes down to the unyielding realities of maritime logistics and ocean currents in the 16th century.
The tornaviaje.
Yes, that return route discovered by Urdaneta. It dictated that the only reliable way back to the Spanish Empire from Manila was to catch the Kuroshio Current north of Japan and sail east to Acapulco.
So direct communication with Madrid would have taken years for a single round trip.
Mexico was the administrative hub of the Spanish Pacific out of sheer geographical necessity.
And that administrative link created a profound cultural pipeline. We discussed the Tlaxcalan soldiers, but the historical records also detail Mexican sentries stationed in Cavite.
And Peruvian conscripts sent to settle Zamboanga in Mindanao to fight Muslim defenders.
This continuous influx of Latin American recruits even led to the creation of Chavacano,
which is a Mexican-Spanish Creole language still spoken today.
That demographic reality really challenges the traditional view of a simple Spanish-Filipino binary.
It does. The colonial military and administrative apparatus relied heavily on Latin American recruits.
The social hierarchy was deeply stratified, but it was also a complex mix of global populations.
And while the civil government was structured with a governor-general holding dictatorial powers, the true, enduring power on the ground was held by the Roman Catholic Church.
So we see a dual mechanism of control here. The cross and the sword. The sources highlight the immense power of the religious orders.
The Augustinians, Jesuits, Dominicans, and Franciscans.
Because King Philip II explicitly ordered a bloodless pacification of the Philippines?
He wanted to avoid repeating the demographic catastrophes and horrific violence of the conquests in the Americas.
But while the initial conquests saw less outright slaughter than the campaigns in the Americas, the reality of that pacification was a deeply coercive administrative matrix.
The Spanish maintained control through the constant threat of violence and severe systemic exploitation.
And the church became the primary instrument of cultural reorganization.
Because the colonial state was chronically underfunded and understaffed by civil officials.
So the Spanish friars essentially became the local government in the rural provinces,
They were the ones implementing the policy of reducciones.
which was consolidating disparate, scattered maritime villages into centralized, grid-patterned towns centered around a stone church.
Indeed, this process of deliberate spatial consolidation made it far easier to convert the inhabitants to Christianity,
And to monitor their daily activities.
and critically, to extract taxes and labor.
Right. The religious orders controlled the spiritual lives of the population, but they also controlled primary education, hospitals, and eventually vast tracts of the most productive agricultural land.
The secular governor-general often found himself in fierce power struggles with the Archbishop of Manila.
Who wielded enough influence to sometimes assume the reins of state during periods of civil vacancy.
It was a very tense balance of power.
So, with this spiritual and administrative hierarchy established, the colonial government needed a way to fund itself.
Which was an ongoing issue since this remote colony was consistently running a deficit.
This led the Spanish to implement severe, highly extractive economic structures. Let's examine the encomienda system first.
The encomienda system was authorized in the Philippines in 1568. This was an early system of land and labor tax farming granted to the conquistadors.
So how did that actually work on paper?
Well, the crown would essentially entrust a specific indigenous population to a Spanish settler, the encomendero. In theory, the encomendero provided military protection and Catholic instruction.
And in exchange, he had the legal right to collect tribute and demand labor.
Right, but in practice, it functioned as a brutal mechanism of exploitation.
The documentation describes it as effectively legalizing a more oppressive conquest.
It involved forced labor, illegal property seizures, and frequent atrocities against the native population.
It was so rife with abuse that the crown eventually had to phase it out in favor of direct provincial governance under appointed magistrates.
It was a system designed for rapid resource extraction by early settlers, and it bred deep, enduring resentment.
But the localized taxation of the native population was not the primary macroeconomic driver of the colony, was it?
No, the true economic engine, and the reason Spain valued Manila so highly, was the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade.
Which represents one of the first true global trade networks, running continuously from 1565 all the way to 1815.
It was a monumental logistical achievement. Manila became the absolute center of trade in Asia during the 17th and 18th centuries.
With Chinese merchants, known as Sanglis, bringing silks, porcelain, lacquerware, and spices to Manila.
And these highly sought-after luxury goods were loaded onto massive wooden galleons.
Many of which, we should note, were built using forced indigenous labor in the shipyards of Cavite.
Yes, and then they sailed across the Pacific Ocean to Acapulco.
In return, the galleons brought back Mexican silver. We are talking about an average of 75 tons of silver bullion arriving in Manila every single year.
That silver was used to pay the Chinese merchants, effectively creating a trans-Pacific silver bridge between the Americas and Ming and Qing dynasty China.
And this global trade had profound demographic consequences for Manila itself.
Oh, definitely. It attracted a vast influx of Chinese merchants and skilled artisans,
They became vital to the colonial economy.
serving as the primary suppliers of consumer goods, fresh food, and skilled labor for the Spanish elites.
However, the Spanish authorities were deeply paranoid about their rapidly growing numbers.
So they forced the Chinese to live in a strictly segregated district outside the city walls known as the Parian.
Where their activities could be closely monitored and taxed.
And that paranoia frequently boiled over into horrific violence.
The colonial ledgers document periodic, state-sanctioned massacres of the Chinese population.
Most notably, in 1603, when over 20,000 Chinese residents were killed after an uprising fueled by Spanish taxation and abuse.
Yet the Spanish quickly realized they could not run the colony's economy without them.
So new waves of Chinese immigrants always returned, repopulating the Parian.
Because while the Spanish elite residing in Manila grew incredibly wealthy off the galleon trade, The broader colony remained a financial drain on the empire,
The tribute taxes collected from the native population were insufficient to sustain the sprawling colonial administration.
which relied heavily on that annual subsidy of silver from Mexico, known as the Situado.
Right. And to squeeze every possible resource out of the native population to make up the difference, the Spanish implemented what can only be described as a coercive fiscal matrix.
So if you were listening and trying to understand what this meant for the average person living under Spanish rule, it meant a life defined by inescapable heavy taxation.
First, there was the tributo,
This was the base tax, initially set at 8 reales, later raised to 10.
and it was mandatory for all males aged 19 to 60.
It could be paid in cash or in raw agricultural commodities, depending on the whims of the current governor general.
And that variability in payment methods was weaponized against the population.
How so? Can you give an example?
For instance, Governor General Bravo de Acuña banned payments in crops, forcing subsistence peasants to desperately find scarce coinage.
Which was incredibly difficult for them to get.
Very difficult. But then later, Governor General Niño de Tabora reversed this policy entirely.
Banning cash payments and forcing farmers to hand over their harvests?
Right, to ensure the government had enough food supplies in the storehouses. It kept the local population in a perpetual state of economic anxiety and dependency,
But the tributo was just the baseline. Then you have the bandala.
which we touched on in the beginning.
Yes, and this system was uniquely devastating to the rural economy.
The colonial government assigned annual crop quotas to each province. The farmers were forced to sell their harvest directly to the state.
And the critical detail here is the payment method. The government paid for these forced sales with unredeemable, unpaid promissory notes.
It is a system designed to systematically bankrupt the agricultural class to subsidize the state.
And the fiscal extraction did not stop there. There were specialized taxes based on your geographical location.
Right. If you lived in Zamboanga in the south, you paid the Zamboangan to fund the ongoing military campaigns against the Muslim sultanates.
If you lived on the coast, you paid the Vinta or the Falua to fund the construction of defensive watchtowers against pirate raids.
Every single aspect of native productivity was heavily taxed and monitored.
And eventually, in 1884, the tributo was replaced by the cedula personal.
Which was a mandatory identification paper that everyone over 18 had to purchase annually,
It functioned simultaneously as a universal poll tax and a strict surveillance tool.
criminalizing anyone found without their papers and restricting freedom of movement.
Beyond taxation, the Spanish extracted physical labor through the polo y servicio, the corvée labor system,
This was arguably the most hated institution of Spanish rule.
because it mandated 40 days of unpaid manual labor per year for all males aged 16 to 60.
These workers, called polistas, were forced to construct stone churches, government administrative buildings, military roads, and cut dense timber in the mountains.
And as we discussed earlier, they built the enormous galleons in the Cavite shipyards.
The human cost of this infrastructure was staggering,
Men were pulled away from their farms during crucial planting and harvesting seasons.
which caused agricultural disruption, low crop yields, and widespread starvation in their home villages.
Many polistas died from tropical diseases, malnutrition, or the highly hazardous working conditions in the shipyards.
And there was a legal loophole built into the system. A wealthy individual could pay an exemption fee called the fala.
Which amounted to a significant sum.
So this meant the brutal physical burden of building the colonial infrastructure fell exclusively on the absolute poorest segments of society.
This system was completely unsustainable without severe physical coercion.
And it directly sparked numerous regional rebellions.
A prime example being the Sumeroy Rebellion in 1649.
Yes, Augustin Sumeroy in northern Samar rebelled specifically against a colonial order, sending his fellow men across the archipelago to the distant Cavite shipyards.
He actually established an independent rebel government in the mountains before being captured and executed by the Spanish in 1650.
And the Spanish response to these localized rebellions was invariably violent military suppression.
But despite this heavy-handed centralized control radiating from Manila, Spanish authority was far from absolute.
Large swaths of the archipelago and the surrounding seas remained highly contested for the entire 333-year period.
It's easy to look at a colonial map of the Spanish East Indies and assume total hegemony, but the geography of the Philippines tells a very different story.
It does. The Spanish quickly learned that claiming an island on a map and actually subduing the people living in its mountains are two entirely different realities.
Consider the Igorot people of the Cordillera Mountains in northern Luzon.
The Igorot people represent a remarkable history of successful indigenous resistance.
The Spanish launched multiple, heavily armed military expeditions into the steep Cordillera Mountains.
Driven both by a desire to convert the population to Catholicism and a desperate need to control the region's rich gold mines.
And they employed brutal, scorched earth tactics, right?
Burning villages, destroying centuries-old terrace farms, and attempting to starve the mountain population into submission.
Yet for 350 years, the Igorots were never fully conquered.
They utilized the treacherous, steep mountain terrain to their tactical advantage.
Rolling boulders down narrow passes and staging ambushes.
They maintained their independence, their indigenous culture, and their economic autonomy completely outside the reach of the colonial administrative state.
Their successful resistance really highlights the strict limits of Spanish military projection.
The colonial state was powerful in the lowlands and the coastal urban centers, where their naval artillery could reach.
But it struggled significantly in the dense interiors and mountainous highlands.
And that military limitation was even more pronounced in the south, during the centuries-long conflict known as the Moro Wars.
Now, the Spanish viewed the Muslim sultanates in Mindanao and Sulu through a very specific historical ideological lens.
The historical texts showed that the Spanish considered their war with the Muslims in Southeast Asia as a direct extension of the Reconquista.
The centuries-long military campaign to drive the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula in Europe.
That ideological baggage is crucial to understanding the conflict.
The Spanish arrived in the Philippines with a deep-seated, culturally ingrained Islamophobia,
viewing the indigenous Muslims, whom they dubbed Moros, as natural historical enemies.
They attempted to militarily subjugate the established sultanates, leading to over 3 centuries of intermittent, highly destructive maritime warfare.
And the sultanates fought back fiercely. Moro raiders launched highly organized, fast-moving naval attacks on the Christianized coastal areas of Luzon and the Visayas.
They disrupted Spanish shipping lanes, pillaged colonial settlements, and captured thousands of inhabitants to be sold in regional slave markets.
The threat was so pervasive and constant that the Spanish forced the coastal populations to build those tall stone watchtowers we discussed earlier.
And the alarm cry, "Hay Moros en la costa, the Moors are coming," became a colloquial expression for impending danger that survived long after the colonial era.
The Spanish were never able to fully defeat the sultanates, relying on fragile treaties and limited coastal garrisons to maintain a tenuous balance of power in the southern islands.
And the colonial state did not just face internal resistance. Manila was constantly under threat from external empires and privateers.
We have the Chinese pirate Limahan, who laid siege to Manila in 1574 with a large fleet of warships.
Then there were the Japanese pirate incursions,
like the Woku Lord Teifusa, who established an independent state in Cagayan in 1580 before the Spanish violently dislodged his forces.
But the most severe, sustained external threat to Spanish rule came from the Dutch Republic during the broader European 80 Years' War.
In the mid-17th century, heavily armed Dutch naval squadrons repeatedly blockaded Manila Bay
and attacked the treasure-laden Spanish galleons,
attempting to bankrupt the colonial treasury and physically seize the archipelago for their own empire.
This external pressure culminated in the battles of La Naval de Manila in 1646,
where the Spanish forces were vastly outnumbered.
They had just 2 aging, commercially retrofitted Manila galleons and a single galley,
crewed mainly by Filipino conscripts and volunteers,
facing off against 3 separate Dutch squadrons totaling 18 purpose-built warships.
But against all conventional military logic and naval doctrine, the combined Spanish-Filipino forces severely defeated the Dutch across 5 separate naval engagements,
forcing the Dutch Republic to permanently abandon its strategic plans to invade the Philippines.
And the Catholic hierarchy in Manila attributed the improbable victory to the miraculous intervention of Our Lady of the Rosary, cementing a deep religious narrative around the defense of the colony.
But the perceived invincibility of Intramuros and the Spanish military was completely shattered a century later.
During the global conflict of the 7 Years' War, the British arrived.
In 1762, British forces successfully besieged, bombarded, and captured Manila,
occupying the capital city for 2 full years, until the Treaty of Paris returned the territory to Spain in 1764.
The British occupation was a profound watershed moment.
It fundamentally broke the carefully cultivated illusion of Spanish invulnerability.
It proved to the world, and more importantly, to the local Filipino populations who witnessed the defeat, that Spanish control was brittle.
This disruption, combined with changing global economic paradigms in the late 18th century, forced the Spanish crown to drastically rethink its isolationist mercantilist policies.
Right, because the Spanish administration realizes they cannot just rely on the monopoly of the galleon trade anymore.
The colony actually has to generate its own internal revenue to survive.
This economic desperation leads to a major economic transformation. Governor General Jose Basco takes power, serving from 1778 to 1787.
And Governor General Basco is a pivotal figure in Philippine economic history.
He recognized that the Philippines possessed immense, untapped agricultural potential.
So he implemented aggressive economic reforms to transition the colony from a mere transshipment port toward an export-oriented agricultural economy.
His most significant and controversial move was the establishment of a strict government monopoly on tobacco production.
Under this monopoly, the state dictated exactly where tobacco could be grown.
Forced farmers in regions like the Cagayan Valley to meet strict, punishing production quotas.
And set the mandatory purchase price arbitrarily low.
It was highly profitable for the Spanish treasury, finally providing the colony with a significant source of internal income.
But it was disastrous for the farmers who were locked into an exploitative single-crop system.
That often left them without enough land to grow food for their own families.
Basco's reforms laid the agricultural groundwork, but the true catalyst for the Philippines' integration into the broader global economy occurred in 1869.
With the opening of the Suez Canal.
Yes, the Suez Canal changed the geometry of global trade.
It slashed the travel time between European markets and the Philippines from several dangerous months around the Cape of Good Hope to mere weeks.
The sudden maritime accessibility created immense, insatiable European and American demand for Philippine cash crops.
Specifically sugar, abaca, which is Manila hemp used for naval ropes and coffee.
And to meet this international demand, traditional communal lands were rapidly privatized
and transformed into large-scale commercial plantations known as haciendas.
This surge in international trade generated unprecedented local wealth.
And it gave rise to an entirely new social structure. We see the emergence of a powerful middle class, heavily dominated by two groups, the Chinese-Filipino mestizos and the Principalia.
Let's clearly define the Principalia first.
Okay, what was their role?
The Principalia were the native landed oligarchy. They were the direct hereditary descendants of the pre-colonial Day 2 class.
So they already had that ancestral authority.
Yes, but under Spanish rule, their authority had been strategically co-opted. The Spanish appointed them as gobernadorcillos, or municipal mayors, and cabezas de barangay, village heads.
They essentially served as the local tax collectors and administrative intermediaries for the colonial state,
absorbing the anger of the peasantry while accumulating wealth.
And what about the Chinese-Filipino mestizos?
The demographic records note they made up about 5% of the population by the early 19th century, but wielded highly disproportionate economic influence over domestic trade.
Because the Spanish placed heavy legal, financial, and geographic restrictions on pure-blooded Chinese immigrants.
Right, so Chinese men frequently married indigenous women. Their offspring, the mestizos, were legally classified as subjects of Spain,
which afforded them rights denied to the Chinese,
such as the ability to own land, travel without special permits, and participate in local politics.
They became highly successful merchants, regional money lenders, and increasingly powerful landowners.
Particularly in the fertile, sugar-producing provinces of central Luzon.
So you have this new wealth, and you have these two elite groups looking to expand their holdings. How did land ownership shift so drastically from traditional communal village holdings to massive private haciendas owned by a few powerful families?
This transition was facilitated by Spanish legal reforms, specifically the Mora Law of 1893 and the Mora Act of 1894.
Spearheaded by the Spanish Minister of Colonies, Antonio Mara.
Exactly.
I want to focus deeply on the mechanics of the Mara Act, because it is a devastating piece of legislation.
It was designed ostensibly to standardize land ownership by requiring all landowners to acquire official, written documentation of their land titles within a strict one-year period.
Any undocumented land after April 17, 1895 would automatically revert to the state domain.
And this is where the asymmetry of information and power becomes highly predatory.
Right, because the vast majority of the native peasantry were entirely illiterate.
And completely unaware of this complex bureaucratic decree published in the official Gaceta de Manila.
They operated on traditional, centuries-old communal understandings of land rights and usufruct.
The right to use the land without holding a piece of European paper.
Meanwhile, the literate elite, the Principalia and the mestizos, understood the new legal framework perfectly,
They used this one-year window to legally register large tracts of ancestral lands.
including the lands currently being farmed by their own neighbors and dependents, under their own names at the registry office.
The result was the systematic, legalized dispossession of the native farmers.
Independent, self-sufficient smallholders were instantly transformed into debt-ridden share tenants known as kasama.
They were now forced to pay rent to work the very land they had farmed for generations, but no longer legally owned.
This created a deeply unequal, quasi-feudal agrarian structure that continues to heavily impact Philippine society and politics today.
At the same time this profound economic stratification is happening, there is a parallel revolution occurring in education.
Right. In 1863, Spain passes the Educational Decree,
This established a complete public school system.
requiring at least one primary school for boys and one for girls in each municipality.
And mandated the creation of normal schools to train professional teachers.
But the colonial logic behind this educational decree was highly pragmatic, not altruistic.
The expanding colonial state and the rapidly growing export economy needed a competent cadre of basic clerks, accountants, and low-level bureaucratic officials to process the new wealth.
They wanted a compliant, Spanish-speaking workforce to handle the paperwork of empire.
But by providing standardized education, the Spanish inadvertently supplied the Filipinos with the intellectual tools to question, critique, and ultimately attempt to dismantle colonial rule.
The wealth generated by the export economy allowed the new middle class to send their children to prestigious universities in Manila.
And for the wealthiest families, to study abroad in Madrid, Paris, and London.
These highly educated children of the elite became known as the ilustrados, the enlightened ones.
In the universities and cafes of Europe, they were heavily exposed to the potent political ideals of the French and American revolutions.
Liberty, equality, constitutionalism, and human rights.
They sharply realized that the basic civil rights enjoyed by citizens in Europe were completely denied to them in their own homeland.
This new educated class, combined with the extreme economic inequality of the hacienda system and long-simmering tensions within the Catholic Church, ignited the first true sparks of a national consciousness.
The early friction points did not begin with calls for armed rebellion, but with an internal conflict within the religious hierarchy, the secularization movement.
To understand the weight of this movement, we must look at the rigid, racially defined hierarchy within the Catholic Church in the Philippines.
The clergy was divided into two distinct, often antagonistic camps, the regular clergy and the secular clergy.
The regulars were the Spanish friars, the Augustinians, Dominicans, Franciscans, and Recollects.
They belonged to religious orders, and they held the real administrative power.
They controlled the vast majority of the wealthy local parishes and owned enormous agricultural estates, the so-called friar lands we discussed earlier.
Opposed to them were the secular clergy. These were priests who did not belong to a religious order and reported directly to the local bishop.
Because very few Spanish priests wanted to migrate to the remote, tropical Philippine colony, the secular clergy was composed almost entirely of native Filipinos and mestizos.
In Catholic doctrine, standard parish work was supposed to be the primary domain of the secular priests.
But the Spanish friars fiercely guarded their control over the Philippine parishes.
Because those positions were the source of their immense political and economic influence over the population.
And they used deeply racist justifications to keep the native priests marginalized.
The regular clergy actively argued to the Spanish crown and the Vatican that native Filipinos were intellectually inferior and morally unsuited for the complex responsibilities of parish leadership.
Furthermore, they raised the specter of political subversion.
They warned that if native priests were given administrative control over the parishes, they would use their significant influence over the masses to lead a secessionist rebellion.
Explicitly pointing to the central role native Mexican priests had played in the recent Mexican Wars of Independence.
This systemic discrimination sparked a fierce, highly organized advocacy movement among the native clergy.
They demanded ecclesiastical equality and the immediate implementation of church decrees that mandated the secularization of parishes.
The movement was initially led by Father Pedro Pelaez, a brilliant theologian who raised funds, wrote persuasive pamphlets, and formally petitioned the Queen of Spain.
Tragically, Pelaez was killed when the Manila Cathedral collapsed during a severe earthquake in 1863.
But his intellectual protege, Father José Burgos, took up the mantle.
Burgos was highly educated, holding multiple doctorates, and he aggressively campaigned against the racial discrimination, preventing native priests from governing their own parishes.
The tension in Manila was palpable, and the Spanish authorities were deeply paranoid about any hint of rebellion.
This paranoia exploded into profound historical tragedy in 1872.
On January 20, 1872, a brief mutiny broke out among Filipino soldiers and arsenal workers at Fort San Felipe in Cavite.
The soldiers were specifically protesting a sudden policy change, the revocation of their traditional exemption from the tribute tax and forced labor.
The Spanish military brutally crushed the localized mutiny within a few days.
But the reactionary governor-general, Rafael de Izquierdo, saw a broader political opportunity in the chaos.
Izquierdo used this localized labor dispute as a pretext to entirely eliminate the intellectual leadership of the secularization movement.
He accused Father Burgos, along with two other prominent native priests, Father Mariano Gomez and Father Jacinto Zamora, of secretly masterminding the rebellion.
Despite the complete lack of credible evidence, and despite the Archbishop of Manila boldly refusing to defrock the priests because he firmly believed in their innocence, the three men were subjected to a rapid sham military trial.
On February 17, 1872, Fathers Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora, collectively remembered by the acronym Gumburza, were publicly executed by garrote.
The garrote is a method of execution involving a metal collar tightened by a screw to slowly strangle the victim and snap the spinal cord.
The public spectacle of their death on the killing fields of Bagumbayan was intended by the colonial state to terrorize the population into absolute submission.
But the execution achieved the exact opposite of its intended effect.
The martyrdom of Gomburza was a traumatic, unifying event.
As the execution took place, church bells tolled in collective mourning across the territory.
It galvanized the educated elite, proving definitively that moderate reform within the Spanish colonial system was impossible, regardless of one's education, wealth, or social standing.
The terror of 1872 drove the intellectual elite, the Ilustrados, to seek reform from a safer distance.
Many fled into exile in Europe, initiating what became known as the propaganda movement.
They used the press to expose the abuses of the friars and the colonial administration, demanding basic civil rights, representation of the Spanish Cortes, and equality before the law.
The most prominent figure of this movement was, without question, José Rizal.
A polymath physician and brilliant writer, Rizal authored two foundational novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo.
These novels offered a searing, satirical, and ultimately devastating critique of Spanish colonial society, exposing the hypocrisy of the religious orders and the deep suffering of the native population.
It is highly significant that Rizal dedicated his second novel, Il Fili, explicitly to the memory of Gomburza.
He was drawing a direct, undeniable line from their unjust martyrdom to the absolute necessity of national awakening.
Rizal's literature circulated secretly within the Philippines, smuggled past colonial censors, and fundamentally shifted the political consciousness of the literate classes.
He articulated a distinct Filipino identity separate from Spain.
However, Rizal and the broader propaganda movement primarily advocated for peaceful reform and assimilation, hoping Spain would grant the Philippines the status of a regular represented province.
But Spain remained entirely intransigent. The peaceful petitions were ignored, the liberal reforms were rejected, and Rizal himself was eventually arrested and exiled to Mindanao.
When peaceful reform through the pen failed, the movement transitioned to the sword.
The demand shifted from assimilation to outright armed separation. The revolutionary pressure had reached a boiling point by 1896.
The catalyst for armed revolution was the founding of a clandestine secret society known as the Katipunan, led by Andres Bonifacio.
Unlike the propaganda movement, which was driven by the wealthy, European-educated Ilustrados, the Katipunan drew its membership primarily from the urban working classes and the rural peasantry.
The very masses who bore the physical brunt of the taxation and the polo y servicio.
The Katipunan utilized elaborate Masonic rites and blood compacts to ensure absolute secrecy and loyalty.
Their singular, uncompromising goal was armed revolution to achieve complete independence from Spain.
In August 1896, the Spanish authorities discovered the existence of the secret society through a confession, forcing Bonifacio's hand prematurely.
This discovery led to the historic event known as the Cry of Pugadloan,
where Bonifacio and his followers tore up their cedulas, the hated personal identification papers that symbolized colonial subjugation and taxation, and openly declared armed rebellion.
The Philippine Revolution had begun.
The revolution quickly spread across the provinces, particularly in the Tagalog region around Manila.
But almost immediately, the revolution faced a crucial internal conflict. We have a divided house.
On one side, you have the masses led by Bonifacio, the ideological founder of the Katipunan.
On the other side, you have the provincial elite, particularly in the province of Cavite, led by a young local mayor named Emilio Aguinaldo.
This internal power struggle highlights the deep structural class divisions within Filipino society that had been exacerbated by centuries of Spanish economic policies.
Bonifacio was a charismatic organizer from the urban working class, but he suffered a series of costly tactical military defeats against the heavily armed Spanish colonial forces in the capital region.
Meanwhile, Aguinaldo, commanding the Magdalo faction in Cavite, was achieving stunning, highly publicized military victories.
Capturing Spanish armories, utilizing trench warfare, and driving colonial forces out of several heavily defended towns.
Aguinaldo's military success translated into immense political capital.
The provincial elite, the Principalia, gravitated toward his leadership, viewing Bonifacio as militarily ineffective and socially inferior.
This deep factionalism paralyzed the broader revolutionary effort. To resolve the leadership dispute and unify the command, a convention was held at Tejeros in 1897.
The Tejeros Convention was essentially a political coup by the Cavite elite.
They voted to dissolve the Katipunan and establish a new revolutionary government, electing Aguinaldo as president.
Bonifacio, feeling the elections were rigged and his foundational authority disrespected by the elites, refused to recognize the results.
This internal division culminated in tragedy. Aguinaldo, viewing Bonifacio as a profound threat to the unified command of the fragile revolution, ordered his arrest.
Following a highly controversial military trial marked by factional bias, Andres Bonifacio, the founder of the Katipunan, was executed by his own countrymen in the mountains of Maragondon in May 1897.
The execution of Bonifacio cemented Aguinaldo's Magdalo faction as the undisputed leaders of the revolution.
But despite unifying the command structure, the military reality on the ground was becoming increasingly bleak.
The Spanish had rushed reinforcements from the peninsula, launching a brutal counteroffensive that drove Aguinaldo's forces out of Cavite and into the mountains of Bulacan.
By late 1897, the conflict had devolved into a bloody military stalemate.
The Spanish could not completely crush the guerrilla resistance in the mountains, and the Filipino forces lacked the heavy artillery and ammunition to capture the fortified capital of Manila.
This mutual exhaustion led to a negotiated ceasefire known as the Pact of Biaknabato.
Under the terms of the pact, Aguinaldo and his high command agreed to go into voluntary exile in Hong Kong in exchange for financial compensation and vague promises of future administrative reforms from the Spanish Governor-General.
To many observers, it appeared the revolution had failed.
But just as the domestic conflict hit a stalemate, global geopolitics dramatically intervened,
Entirely altering the fate of the Philippines and ending Spanish rule through an external shock.
Halfway across the world, tensions between Spain and the United States exploded over the sinking of the USS Maine in Cuba,
leading to the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in April 1898.
The United States, looking to expand its global naval influence, instantly expanded the theater of war to the Pacific.
Commodore George Dewey, commanding the heavily armed U.S. Asiatic Squadron stationed in Hong Kong, received orders to attack the Spanish fleet anchored in the Philippines.
On May 1st, 1898, Dewey sailed into Manila Bay and engaged the antiquated Spanish naval forces.
The Battle of Manila Bay was an absolute rout.
The modern American warships completely destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet in a matter of hours, suffering only negligible casualties.
Dewey's decisive victory fundamentally shattered Spanish naval power in the region, leaving the capital city of Manila entirely cut off from reinforcement and highly vulnerable.
Recognizing the strategic value of the local insurgency to harass the Spanish ground forces, the Americans transported Emilio Aguinaldo back to the Philippines from his exile in Hong Kong.
Aguinaldo returned to the archipelago with a vengeance.
He rapidly reorganized the revolutionary forces, procured new weapons, and launched a highly successful offensive across Luzon.
The Filipino army captured tens of thousands of Spanish prisoners and effectively liberated the entire archipelago, isolating the remaining Spanish forces entirely within the walled city of Intramuros.
Believing that the United States was acting as a liberator and a political ally, Aguinaldo moved quickly to formalize the nation's sovereignty before the war concluded.
On June 12, 1898, At his home in Cavite, Cavite, he officially read the Declaration of Independence.
establishing the first Philippine Republic.
But the dynamic between the American forces and the Filipino revolutionaries was rapidly deteriorating.
The Americans began landing tens of thousands of ground troops, establishing their own military presence around Manila.
The Filipino forces had completely surrounded the capital, cutting off food and water to the Spanish defenders inside, preparing for a final assault.
The Spanish military command realized that surrender was entirely inevitable.
However, driven by centuries of deep-seated racial disdain, they absolutely refused to surrender to the native Filipino forces.
They feared reprisals and viewed a capitulation to their former colonial subjects as an intolerable stain on Spanish honor.
To avoid this, they orchestrated one of the most cynical betrayals in colonial history.
The Spanish commanders secretly negotiated with the American generals to stage a mock battle for Manila.
On August 13, 1898, the Americans and the Spanish enacted a highly choreographed military theater.
After a brief exchange of naval fire to satisfy the requirements of military honor, the Spanish formally surrendered the city to the United States forces.
Crucially, the American forces deliberately blocked the Filipino Revolutionary Army from entering their own capital city.
The First Philippine Republic, which actually controlled the rest of the country, was completely locked out of the surrender and the subsequent diplomatic peace negotiations.
The betrayal was finalized at the diplomatic table in Europe.
On December 10, 1898, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris, formally ending the Spanish-American War.
In this treaty, Spain completely ignored the existence of the independent Philippine Republic.
Spain simply ceded the entire Philippine archipelago to the United States in exchange for a payment of $20 million.
The colonial masters changed, but the colonial status remained.
The Spanish flag came down over Intramuros after 333 years, formally ending their era of rule.
As we conclude this deep dive, we have to synthesize the enduring institutional legacy left behind by Spain.
It is a highly complex inheritance.
On one hand, Spain created the physical boundaries and the centralized administrative state of the modern Philippines.
They consolidated thousands of independent, disparate barangays into a single, cohesive geographic and political entity.
They also left behind a profound cultural and religious imprint, fundamentally altering the spiritual landscape and making the Philippines the only predominantly Roman Catholic nation in Asia.
However, the socioeconomic legacy was deeply toxic.
The Spanish legal framework, particularly laws like the Mara Act, permanently disenfranchised the native peasantry.
They entrenched a highly unequal feudal land system dominated by massive haciendas.
A system that actually expanded under the subsequent American occupation as the U.S. administration co-opted those same landed elites to maintain local control.
It solidified a culture of patron-client political dynamics where power is concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy provincial families, a reality that continues to shape Philippine politics today.
Indeed.
So, I will leave you with a final thought to mull over. The Spanish arrived to extract wealth and impose their worldview, utilizing systemic coercion, forced labor, and religious doctrine to control the population. They unified the archipelago geographically and administratively for their own benefit, but it was precisely the shared suffering, the collective trauma of taxation, the forced labor in the shipyards, and the martyrdom of figures like Gumbursa and Rizal that ultimately forged the Filipino national identity. The colonial project inadvertently manufactured the very nationalism that overthrew it.
That's a great point.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.